Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm joined by the legendary Steve Bell, one of the UK's most iconic political cartoonists. For over 4 decades, Steve's sharp wit and unforgettable caricatures graced the pages of the Guardian newspaper, shaping how people in the UK viewed political events and figures. In 2023, after 40 years of continuous contributions, Steve's contract with the Guardian came to an unexpected end, and that's something we'll explore in detail during our conversation. Now, Steve's work showcases the vital role that cartoonists play in getting us to think differently and speaking truth to power, often in ways that words alone cannot. And in our conversation, you'll hear how his satirical perspective and creative process provokes thought, challenges authority, and shines a light on societal issues. But the skills that Steve uses, observation, creativity, and finding new angles, aren't just for cartoons. They're also tools that can help all of us to mitigate human risk by improving how we communicate, think critically, and approach challenges. We discuss the importance of recognizing the talents we and others have and perhaps don't have, and how those can best be put to use. Steve's story, including how failing in his initial choice of a teaching career led to him doing what he does now, is a testament to the power of finding your true calling and pursuing it on your own terms, even when the path forward is far from clear. It's an inspiring reminder of what can happen when we channel our unique skills into work that truly resonates. For those unfamiliar with Steve's work, you can have a look in the show notes. I've put links to some of his cartoons there. And listeners who are not familiar with UK politics, which forms a key part of his work, I've also included a guide there with links to relevant cartoons. That'll give you a sense of Steve's extraordinary talent and the sharp humour that he brings to his art. So do take a look at that before listening to the episode, or alternatively, it might even be more rewarding to hear Steve describe his process and then explore his work afterwards. Now, warning, the episode does contain adult language and themes, so listener discretion's advised. And since we're exploring Steve's politics, which is unapologetically woven into his work, this might not be for everyone. That said, this is an absolutely fascinating, thought-provoking, and at times provocative discussion about the intersection of art, politics, and the human condition. There is something fabulous when guests on the show are just willing to share their insights, experiences, and perspectives freely, and Steve did exactly that. This was such a pleasure to record, and I'm still reflecting on the many wonderful insights he shared. So without further ado, please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Steve Bell on cartooning. Steve, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. What do we do now? A talk. Okay.
We absolutely talk, and I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me. When I look at what you do, my start is to say that there must be a point where you realize you have the talent and then deploy it in the way that you do. Do you see those things as separate, or am I looking at it from a non-artist perspective?
No. I think these things are all sort of linked together. You know, we don't really know. You find out very early on what you're good at and what you're not good at. I mean, I always liked drawing, so that goes back to earliest days. But thinking about doing drawing for a living, that came much, much later. I didn't really even conceive of doing it for a living until I tried teaching. And I was so bad at teaching. I mean, I suppose somewhere in the back of my mind, I might have entertained a fantastic idea because I kept on drawing, and I kept on drawing for my own pleasure, right through college, right through uni, right through training to be a teacher even. I studied art for many years. I enjoyed art. I enjoyed politics as well. I sort of, I moved left, I suppose, as I became older and became more interested in the world and the way it worked. My friends were that way inclined as well, I think. But cartooning was kind of a constant in the back of my mind, something I did to please myself, as it were. It wasn't until I had the shock of trying to be a teacher that I realised, I've got to get out of this. I cannot stand this. I was a teacher only for a year. I managed a year's doing my teaching certificate, because in those, you just changed the rules that you needed to have a teaching certificate in order to teach. Before that, you just needed a degree. But this was just on the cusp in the early 70s. They said, you've got to have a teaching certificate. So after spending a number of years studying art, I graduated and everything, and then spent a year hanging around, not quite sure what I was doing. But I did a little bit of part-time teaching at the local poly. This was in Leeds, at the local Actually, it was called Jacob Kramer College. It was the foundation course, a sort of art college for, where they did the foundation course. And I quite enjoyed that. That was with the groups of kids doing liberal studies, it was then called. And I did enjoy that. We got involved in all sorts of daft things. I remember in those days, I was into film and video in a big way. I veered off doing fine art, which I'd been studying, and ended up specialising in film studies, which was, the great thing about this course in Leeds was it was semi-practical. So you had to do half theoretical history and all the rest of it, history of art, and then history of film, and then you do a dissertation. But you also had to produce 16mm films. And that was a real breeze. And there were only 3 of us on the course. It was very small time. But it was really great. I learned a hell of a lot because one of the 3 of us was an crazed enthusiast and a great fan of Jean-Luc Godard. So he spent years making Jean-Luc Godard pastiches. But anyway, I was into video in a big way. I graduated from art, got my art degree, didn't know what to do. I was working in a bookshop. It was the most hellish bookshop. It was called Books. It was in a derelict. It was a semi-derelict site. It's now been, erased. It was literally just up the road from Jacob Kramer. And it was a dusty dirt. And I ended up doing this job which involved hauling books about in an attic, a dusty, cold, freezing attic. So it wasn't the greatest of jobs, but it paid a pittance. And then, as luck would have it, I got a little piece of work, teaching work from the art college down the road, and did that and led a project in doing video. In those days, doing video is now we do it on our phone. We can make bloody movies on our phone. In those days, to make video, you had this huge contraption. It was the smallest state-of-the-art thing called a Sony Portapack. And it weighed half a ton, but it had a portable camera attached to it. So there was a sort of thick wire going to this pack, which was really heavy. And it used tape that thick, which was reel to reel. So you had to load it up and wind it round, and it went shh. And of course, you're limited to the time of the tape, which I think was 30 minutes. But it did live video. That's image sound. It was in black and white, of course. And I was getting into this in a bigger. This is while I was doing my teaching course too, because it was like a teaching aid in some ways. So I did these projects with these students who were doing liberal studies. Liberal studies means anything.
I was going to say, what is that?
They don't have it anymore. I don't know what it is. It's not one of those things. It's just because for art courses there was always it was considered when art was becoming more trying to academicize itself. Art courses became DIP-ADs, Diploma in Art and Design. Then they became degrees, BA. This was in those days. It was on the cusp, so they're all getting very academic, and liberal studies was something they had to do. So you had to do it in art college. It was like a little bit of you have to do some writing and talking, and it's because most people just wanted to get on do their painting and drawing. Not very interested. It was a compulsory thing, but it's something that actually was quite good to teach because there was no limit. There was no sort of you could do anything really. And so what I did was I had this really nice young students. They were great. There must be about 30 of them, and they were doing a course. They were probably doing a foundation course in art, and they had to do this slot. And so they had me in, and we led this project which involved wandering around Leeds with a porta pack. We borrowed a porta pack from a local sort of place that did one, and so we went on a demo. We did this. They had all sorts of ideas for making a video. It was brilliant what we did, and so I love that. That's why I considered teaching might be a possibility. But then I came up. Having done that, I had to do a teaching course, and I realised that it involved going into school. And the last thing on earth I wanted to do was to go into a school. Unfortunately, I had to. And anyway, I got my certificate, by this time we'd moved to Birmingham. I got a job in a school in Aston, Birmingham, teaching art. And it was bleak. It was a place, firstly, I didn't want to be in Birmingham. I remember vowing only a year before, as we came on the train, came through. It was from Leeds to Exeter, where I'd studied. I did my teaching certificate, and the train went through Birmingham inevitably. And I was looking out the window. I've had relatives in Birmingham for many years. I know Birmingham modestly well, and I was just looking out the window, thinking, the last place on earth I want to live is in Birmingham. I remember another vow I made at that time when I was a sort of a student, rather stupid student, was that I don't want to get married. Marriage is a bourgeois institution. I don't want to go to live in Birmingham. Don't want to, don't want to get married. The other thing I vowed was I never want to be a teacher. This was before I did all this teaching, because I somewhere deep inside I knew I was not cut out to be a teacher. But anyway, so within like 2 years of making that vow, I was doing all three. I was living in Birmingham, working as a teacher, and I'd got married. So I'd done all three terrible things. Actually, they didn't turn out to be terrible at all. Teaching wasn't good. Living in Birmingham wasn't great, but it was okay. But getting married was a very wise and sound decision. I'm very glad I think I was a young fool in those days. So anyway, you know Will, my son, and this is a long time ago, and Heather and I are still together after all these years. And so I was... How do we get to this point? Why do you do the things you do? Well, after that, the year in Birmingham, I was teaching in Aston, in the school called Aston Manor. I don't wish to insult the place. It's probably still going, but it was just a kind of comprehensive school, co-ed. It was a very high immigrant population. It was there. I mean, there was like 70% black kids. So it's quite, for me, it was quite a culture shock coming. I'm from the south, from near London, really, but I lived in Slough, which in those days didn't have a high immigrant population at all. So Birmingham was much higher, a very intense kind of immigrant population, and in those days I was all still am all in favour of immigration, and I was learning as I went along. But working in a school with 80% black kids is a bit of a shock, and I was crap at it. I must admit, I was terrible. I couldn't keep order. I didn't gain any respect from any of the kids. They despised me, and I just wanted to escape from the bloody place. And also, you had the complication of teaching art is you have to, every session, you have to get all the paint out and then clear it all up at the end, which takes almost as long as the lesson itself. So it was a bit of a futile year, something I didn't want to be doing. So I realised after a term of doing this, and I'd actually applied for the job, and because I was on doing supply teaching, and there was a permanent job came up, so I thought, I might as well go. Got the job, and then I realised in the January of the new term, I had to have a wisdom tooth operation. It was when you're young, this happens. I had impacted wisdom teeth on 3 sides, I think, the top, bottom, and back, and I had to have this really painful operation to get them out in Dudley Road Hospital in Brum, which meant going in as an inpatient, and it was that I think what made me realise that this wasn't working. I remember thinking, while I was sort of drugged up the eyeballs, I'd had this horrible, painful thing. Oh God! And then I was thinking, something in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh, thank fuck, I don't have to go to school on Monday. The thought of Monday had become so terrifying, and it's a funny thing that you realise, this is daft. What are you doing? You're pushing yourself towards something you feel you ought to be. I feel you ought to be socially useful. I ought to do something, to help people, talk to people. And I was pushing myself something that didn't work for me. And at that point, I suppose I made the decision to come out of teaching. I talked about it with we married by then, my wife, and she was actually she was a social worker. She trained to be a social worker. She qualified as a social worker by then. And she said, look, if it's that bad, she knew I had a lot of work. I had a portfolio of stuff. It wasn't cartoon stuff, just art generally. And I had a friend who was pioneering the way as a cartoonist, a guy called Kipper Williams. He's still a great cartoonist. He's still working hard now. And he was very successful at it. He was doing really well. He was supposed to be doing a postgrad in London, and he was actually looking for work as a cartoonist, and he was sort of paving the way. So I was mad with jealousy, thinking, I want to do that. And so I took the plunge, gave in my notice on the teaching job. So this glorious year came to an end, and focused on trying to make a living as a cartoonist, which was quite strange thing to do, really, because I didn't have any, immediate contacts or anything. I'd got most of them through Kipper. He put me on to several different people. But you just have to go do the legwork, go around, focus on what you think places that might use you. In my case, it was Time Out was a focus. I used to work for a lefty What's On mag in Birmingham, which didn't pay any money, of course. It was called Broadside, but I was doing good work, regular work for them, and I really enjoyed that. And the Arts Lab Press, which is run by a great cartoonist called Hunt Emerson in those days, and he was doing his own cartoons, but also commissioning comics himself and printing comics. And I did work for him too. And one of them paid 30 quid, which wasn't a king's ransom, but it was something. And on that basis, and you just have to go around be open-minded, think, do anything, illustrations. There was a local social work magazine, because I had a connection with social work with my wife, called Social Work Today. It was the national magazine of the British Association of Social Workers. Anyway, probably still exists. I don't know, but I called their bluff and said, "Do you know how cheap good cartoons can be?" And the guy unbelievably took me on. So I got regular work there, and regular work in kids' comics. That's the most important thing, because I'd always loved kids' comics, things like the Beano. I got a rejection letter from the actual Beano, but I worked for what was called IPC in those days, which was International Publishing Company. It's a huge conglomerate that published everything from Woman magazine to Whoopee, which is a comic I ended up working for, to the New Musical Express, to Horse and Hound. And they were all in this massive building on the South Bank called Kingsreach Tower, which the site is still there because there's another tower. They've knocked it down and built another tower. But IPC is long gone and divided into bits and whatever, and its empire is broken up. And the odd thing about IPC was they owned everything. So New Music Express was quite a big deal in those days, in the mid-70s. And I sort of went round there and we're flogging my wares. And as luck would have it, when you start out trying to do this trade, you have to make contact with people. And the best, you can send stuff cold, you can send packages of your great artworks, and they'll obviously most of the time end up there. They always end up in the bin. Mostly it helps to talk to somebody and to strike up some kind of relationship. And it worked in the case of the enemy. I went in there, weirdly, the enemy were on the same floor as Horse and Hound. Can you believe that? Yeah, Horse and Hound, that one, which is like literally horses and hunting. The other end was the NME full of punks. And so I went in there, and this bloke said, "Oh, you like the stuff I was showing," which is just daft, off-the-wall stuff. I was much influenced by Robert Crumb, heavy kind of underground stuff. But, that's the kind of work I was much influenced, even more influenced by the Beano. But if you can imagine a blend of that and underground American culture, that's where I was at. So I had to find a way of doing it so you could do it for 8-year-olds or whatever, and then it's just so cut out the bad language and all that stuff. Anyway, that got me started. And the first regular paid work I had was working for this comic called Whoopee. And it was 30 quid a week, because it was 10 quid for the writing and 20 quid for the drawing. So there's a big skew there, because the writing actually in comics for me is always equally important to the drawing. So your question about how you divide things, in some of my minds, there's no division. Writing a gag and drawing a gag is... they're all interlinked. You love drawing, it works in different ways, but I think we make a mistake about thinking we only think in words, because we don't. We think in pictures too. It's just we don't quite know how we think in pictures, and that's an endlessly fascinating quest. Why does that picture work? So I'm always looking at pictures I like, or famous pictures, and thinking I could, ripping them off. I'm always ripping them off. I copy them, using them in my work, in my cartooning, doing a cartoon about current events. But they're a useful vehicle for making your own. So you borrow the structure of an image, for instance, Liberty leading the people, which is Delacroix, with the naked or semi-naked figure of Liberty with one boob out, but holding the flag and the tricolour, and on the barricades, Liberty at the barricades. It's the most wonderful image and the most, eloquent image as well. It's been reused. I've reused it thousands of times myself. Everybody else has as well. But everybody knows it as well. It's a well-known image. Well, how do these things work? How does visual literacy work? I don't know. I taught art for a year, didn't understand a thing about it. I've drawn cartoons for a living for years. I still don't understand it. I still question what it means, how it works. So that's how I got started. I was mixed up I love the practice of drawing, but I also like talking about it. I always like thinking about it. I always like knowing what I was talking and what's my angle here. What am I trying to say in this cartoon? So and I loved politics. I was into politics, and I wanted to do political comics. There was nothing much paid in that field until I got a break. My first proper break was getting a slot at Time Out magazine, which in those days had quite a strong lefty news element to it. These days it's entirely swept away. It's now just a what's on thing. But obviously it made its pile by a bloke called Tony Elliott, who's now dead, I think. But he started the magazine, and it was a hugely successful formula of like a what's on, all these listings. It was just listings. And these days it's all online. But in those days it was a big deal. And it was quite a small thing when it started, and then it turned into an A4 magazine. And when I was doing it, I had a chunky lefty news bit, and Thatcher had just been voted in. It was 1979, and they were looking to do a regular strip. And they knew my work by then because I've been working in the lefty press, all for nothing really. But they knew the kind of stuff I was doing, and I was enjoying the stuff I did for Birmingham Broadside and for the Leveller, and I was putting a lot into it. And these are quite difficult places to work in, because if you think about political correctness gone mad, well, working in that situation is highly difficult. Because people are so, they'll jump on you for the least kind of thing. And I did get into all sorts of trouble. But on the other hand, you've got to think about what you're saying, what you're trying to say. Another thing that I was impressed by was I met a bloke at the Leveller who was sort of editing the Leveller, called Ian Walker. And he was a live wire, and he approached me because I was doing this thing in Broadside that he knew about. And he said, "Oh, I like your cartoon. Well, we can offer you work, no money." Oh, well, great. And he was doing a story about the advertising biz and the way the TV advertising is divvied up. In those days, all the local, you had Tyne Tees TV, you had Yorkshire TV, you had ATV and Rediffusion doing the South East, or Thames as it became. So it was all, the regional nature of ITV was very important. That's all been blown away because ITV is now merged into a kind of mush. Obviously, local news is still incredibly important. That's something we've, I think, sadly lost. But anyway, he was doing a thing about how they always try out new products get tried out on Tyne Tees because it's cheap, but it also has a good. It's quite a comparatively smaller population, but a much greater range in a tight area. So that's why the advertisers use it. Anyway, he'd written this article. So I did a kind of strip using some of the points he was making, but also making a strip of its own. And that was interesting, working with somebody who was doing a story. So I did this sort of, half-page strip about selling a new product. And the new product was a soft toilet seat. So it was just a stupid idea. So then I did another one with another guy who's a journalist called Tim Gopson, and that was about journalism itself. And that's where I discovered the amazing phrase, "Don't let the facts get in the way of the story, a good story," which is it's sort of the story of journalism, if you like. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. That's a sort of cast iron law that still applies everywhere. And journalism in some ways has got a lot worse. But in other ways, I suppose it's better because it's now, you have this business about the web and it's open, the openness of the web, which is unprecedented, but nobody understands what's going on, do we? Do you?
No.
And I don't, I'm clueless about social media. I don't really understand it. I don't work digitally. I work with a pen and ink on paper. Anyway, I can't. I've been rambling on, but
no, this is absolutely brilliant. I'm just like there's so many things, but I don't want to interrupt you because you're on an absolute roll, and I love the fact that you're honest about this, because most people when they talk about their careers, there's a sort of with hindsight narrative about, well, logically, then I went and did this, and then I went. But most of us, we sort of make it up as we go along. And what I love is the way you were talking about it is you're exploring your talent, where you can deploy that and the constraints around that. And so you've got yourself to time out through this series of adventures.
Yeah, well, that was a big break. That was in 1979. So Thatcher had literally just been elected. And Heather and I were living in Brum. We'd been married 2 years by then. Heather was working as a social worker. I think she was getting a bit fed up with it, but she was very, she was into sort of youth work leading youth Christian, there was a concept called IT, which everybody's forgotten about. It's nothing to do with information technology. This was called intermediate treatment. It was a concept in social work whereby, kids who have problems, you take them on outward bound things, and there was a centre, an IT centre in the middle of Selly Oak, which is near where we lived, and called the 870 Centre, which was run by this bloke who was quite charismatic. I've forgotten his second name, called Jerry. But anyway, Heather was doing her placement work. She was doing a studying course there, and this youth work was very important. But I think the actual grind of being a social worker it's an impossible job when you think about social work. I think it was starting to get her down a bit, and she wanted. Also, the other thing is we both wanted to move out of Birmingham. We were both from London. They said, well, I'm from Slough. I'm born in London, but lived in Slough. Heather's from Edgware, Middlesex, born in London too. And we were sort of keen to get back, that's where our families were and stuff. And we married. We wanted to have kids. And William came along in 1981. So he was born in Brum, of course. So that changed everything. I mean, having young William, suddenly you realise you're utterly responsible for this small creature that's making a noise in the next room, and it's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. But because I'd got this time out break, and it wasn't just a break; it was something that I was really, I was really. I won't say I was on a roll, but I kind of. The idea I presented to them, which they liked, was just the allegory of a farm. So the animals were the people, and the farm management was the Tories, essentially, and that was it. So inevitably it became known as Maggie's Farm. It wasn't my idea. That was just that was, the Bob Dylan song obviously sticks in everybody's mind. And so Maggie's Farm took off, and it did become quite successful. It's quite hard work developing a strip and trying to think, who am I doing this for? What's going on here? But you find out what works, what kind of comic, and this is a comic. It's for grown-ups. It's for people who are interested in politics. That's why, because it's taking the piss out of Thatcher herself, and Thatcher herself took a long time to get to know, as it were, to understand how I could caricature her, and that took a lot of work, a lot of grind, a lot of trial and error. While I was working in Birmingham, and then as I started doing Maggie's Farm in time out, but it kind of worked in that context, and it kind of got quite popular. That was the other thing, and that was so. By that time, I was able to support us both. That's me, Heather, and William. Well, three of us, in fact, and Heather could jack in a job, and we moved down to Brighton. I mean, Heather obviously was. Focused on, we were both focused on bringing William up, but the idea of, bringing children up is something that is chronically undervalued and always has been and continues to be. And I think the reason, the reason we got married in the first place was a cynical tax reason, because I was earning bugger all. And there was this thing called a married person's allowance. So I gave my married person's allowance to Heather while she was supporting us for that couple of years. And then it went the other way about. So it came back again. But I'm not sure if it's come back again. It might have gone away and can come back. But so we got married for cynical tax reasons. But also we wanted to, we wanted to have kids, and that was what we did. So we living in Brighton, Brighton's a very different place to Birmingham. It's by the sea, but we made loads of friends, mainly through having young kids, and we met most of the friends we met are actually through. They also had kids, and we were in the same groups and the same play groups and things like that. And Heather was incredibly enterprising about this sort of thing. She sort of started up, kind of groups where just with friends around, and pooling our kids in creches. There was a thing called the revolving creche, or the revolting creche, which was an institution that carried on through, I think, most of the older kids' lives. Which was, and it was this group who What it did, it gave the parent free time to be able to go and off and do things, and then you put in the hours looking after the creche, as it were. So that was something which was quite phenomenal. And so most of our relations in Brighton were through our kids. That's how that developed. But the main thing is, it was just a good place to be. We were quite, Anyway, so the strip got successful. I ended up getting a job on the Guardian doing a strip. I don't know how I had the energy to do all this stuff when I look back at it, but I started doing a daily strip in '81. That's after William was born. Now that was in addition to doing the weekly Time Out thing, and then other stuff as well. And so it carried on for the next 40 years. And now we've got grandchildren and all the rest of it.
I'm fascinated by the idea of having to produce something on a daily basis, because I can see if you've got a week to produce something, that's fundamentally different to being under pressure to respond to something on a daily basis. Is it hard to come up with ideas, or does the fact that you have the deadlines, is that helpful in the sense that you're going to have to deliver something?
I think I sort of favour the latter, but it's weird, and it's all in most recent development of my career, which is sort of come to a screeching halt. I'm now faced with the thing, what am I now doing? What am I doing now? I think deadlines are good. I use them mercilessly, and I was addicted to them, I freely admit. I wasn't at first, but because I was quite focused about what I did, I think, whether it was a weekly or a monthly or a whatever deadline, it didn't really make much odds. When the daily strip came along for The Guardian, that actually, though I had to do 6 strips, I actually did them in weekly batches, which I would do over a period and send. But I was thinking episodically, and then I'd send the whole lot in, and they do whatever the necessary was and process them. But it was a big workload. And then about 10 years later, I've been doing the strip 10 years, they started asking me to do big ones quite regularly as well. So instead of doing 1 a week, I think at one time I was doing 6 strips a week and 4 big ones a week, which is 10, which is madness. It's just, I don't know how I did it. But I did, I could. I look back and think, what the hell were you playing at? But, deadlines have never fazed me, because you use them. And I must say that to do this, you build up it's probably a kind of illusionary headspace in order to do it. You have to believe in it in order to do it. You have to believe in what you're doing, what you're talking. You have to spend a great deal of time talking to yourself, because you're going through dialogue and verbiage, and making up stories and gags about what's going on. And I have to sort of rehearse it myself, and then as well as doing all the drawing and the stuff. But doing the drawing is great. Once you know what you're doing, you get the radio on, you get the music on, whatever, and you can spend. I spend a lot of time working at night in these days, because it was the only peaceful time when the kids were asleep. So I had vast hours of late at night. I'd be doing a sort of more intricate job, and it was quite peaceful in some ways, but obviously. Yeah, slightly worrying that I can say that now, looking back at it. But the deadlines actually do focus you, in the sense they make you draw quicker. Obviously, cartooning is all about quick drawing. It's all about summing things up in a couple of lines, and it's all about life. The line itself has to stay alive, and it's very easy for a line to die. Because when you're producing a piece for reproduction in black and white, it's quite exacting. It has to be quite precise, and so the drawing is terribly precise sometimes, and but that can be quite deadening in some ways if it's too precise and if it's too planned out looking. Then it lacks life. So you have to keep your own drawing alive, slightly jaggy and scrapey and whatever. I don't know. That's the wonder of drawing, though. It's quick drawing.
One of the things that, if I compare writing with drawing, writing you can obviously edit. I mean, back in the days of typewriters, it's a bit more challenging. But once you've committed to an idea, because you're digital work, you could obviously delete things. But with yours, because you're doing it on paper,
Yeah.
presumably once you're locked into an idea, you've got a little bit of latitude, I'm guessing, to correct things. But you really have to be convinced by it once you start, because I'm guessing the room to move, you couldn't suddenly re-engineer the whole thing. You'd have to start again.
No, you have to. It's no point. It's a bit like editing in the camera if you're doing a film. You can just do it all in the right order. That's editing in the camera. But you have to think the thing through as well. I'm not terribly good at thinking things through, but I'm quite good at asking myself, is this working? No, this is hopeless. Go back, do it again. Or go, or come at it another way. And so I'm thinking about how to take it, make it work. And that's my focus, I suppose, while I'm doing it. Which... Yeah, maybe I don't know. Maybe everybody's like that. I don't know. I think the drawing, whether the drawing works or not, it's not really a separate issue, because the drawing doesn't work if the idea doesn't work. You can have the most beautiful drawing on earth. If it's got a shit idea, it's boring. So yeah, you can't be a perfectionist in it. I think that's the idea of perfectionism. It just strikes me as ludicrous, because do you want something done, or you try and do it to the best of your ability, but if you're going to die if it's not perfect, then you're not going to get anywhere, and it doesn't. So you're deluding yourself, I suppose, if you think the absolute perfection you're seeking is there, because it never is. Perfection comes in unexpected ways. Things that apparently are just tossed off can work out to be the best things you've done. On the contrary, things that you worked at and think are the most brilliant things, they come back in the cold light of dawn and they just look like crap, and they don't work. And so obviously you're looking at things, judging them in that way, and that's how you, I suppose, try and develop stuff. Yeah.
Thinking about the constraints that you're under, a strip is obviously a construct that you have to make. There's certain consistency you need to maintain. I guess the big ones that you're referring to, I'm assuming, is responding to news stories.
Yeah.
How does that work in terms of them giving you artistic freedom? When you're pitching, are you sharing constraints with them, or is this just you do what you think?
Well, you're sharing constraints because obviously you work for any publication, and they will come back and say, oh, well, didn't like that, or you'll get feedback within that loop. When you're doing but the thing is, you do stuff, and if people like it, then they'll accept it. And the thing about doing a regular strip in the paper it's very difficult to get going. Once you've got a bit of momentum, then it builds itself. And because you've got you've gained the trust, if you like, of the people you're publishing for, and they trust you to deliver it. And things like newspapers, they've got this huge amount of stuff they have to produce every day under these conditions. I've never worked at the paper, but I've been and had a look, and you can see how it's high pressure. I'm lucky in a sense, because I've always worked from home, so that insulates me in a way. But it means I can just get on with what I'm best at. And I made an important thing when I started. What that happened with Time Out was a lovely guy called Duncan Campbell, who commissioned it in the first place. He was looking for the strip. I happened to turn up that day, and he happened to be. I've been trying Time Out for years, I think. And the art editors, I never got on well with art editors. I don't know why. We got on much better with the political editor, because as it turned out, I've been to see the art editor about 3 or 4 times and got nowhere. I went in one day, she wasn't there, and he was there, and he said, "Oh yeah, we're looking for a strip," and said, "I was all right." So I went away and worked up a night. That's how it took off. And Duncan, I used to, and this happened with the Leveller beforehand. I'd be talking to people about what was going on. I'd have long conversations with Duncan about what was happening in the world that week, and we just throw ideas around between us, and that was good. That helped me think. And similarly at the Leveller, that had happened. So you're talking things over and mulling it over. The part of the problem is you develop it in such a way that then you can just get on with it yourself, because ultimately Duncan was very busy doing what he did, editing news editing in the paper, which is very high pressure. I was busy drawing it up, and it takes a long time. So extending it to The Guardian, where that started having weekly deadlines or weekly, daily deadlines, I would do the strips in a package of 6 strips. That was the weeks, Monday to Saturday. And you'd send them up by Red Star, the British Railways.
I remember that, yeah.
Go and take it to the station, hand it at the Red Star counter, and it would then get put on the train in the guard's van. Then it would come up to Victoria, handed to the Red Star, be available for collection at the Red Star office. The Guardian would send somebody to pick it up, and that was it. That's how they got the cartoons. There was no fax, there was no email. And I had, it cost very expensive, it was, but you could claim that back from the paper. That wasn't the problem. And that's how it worked for years, all through the 80s and most of the 90s too. And so this package of cartoons, you'd work out quite soon, you'd sniff about the libel laws and say, if you say certain things about certain people, you can't say, for instance, you accuse somebody in a cartoon of being corrupt, because the same rules apply in written journalism as they do in drawn journalism. And you had to be very careful. So there was a couple of weeks stuff where I had to completely redo it because they were worried about libel. And the thing about working with newspapers is looked at the libel. There's 2 sort of lawyers looking at the night lawyers and the day lawyers. They vet everything. So they don't, you can't piss around with them. And it will come back to you eventually. But what you do learn is, what you can do, what's doable, what's not worth even bothering with, and you can you can use it to just sort of peddle your own things. I think The Guardian were actually looking for kind of lefty voices at that time, which is quite unusual. I don't think that's happening anymore. They've been purging lefties for a long time, and I'm probably one of those recent people suffering from that. But in those days, Peter Preston was recruiting lefty cartoonists, because Peter Preston was then editor, was a very nice man who sort of understood cartoons. He'd written cartoon strips himself with Mark Boxer, a well-known cartoonist. They're both sadly dead now, but so he understood the process of cartooning. He was interested to that extent. So he didn't say much, Peter. But he had a sort of very quiet kind of. He'd sit there and you sort of. I think. Eventually you'd be, I feel, obliged to blurt out something just to fill the empty silence, as it were. But and as I say, he was a very nice man. And they were looking for a strip anyway. I think he was consciously looking for something which would appeal to younger, or maybe lefty people. That was something. So they took me on. So I was always on the lefty end of stuff. So I had a certain leeway in that sense. Because the paper, the Guardian is a liberal paper, has always been a liberal paper ever since it was first invented. And I think that depends on, having a variety of points of view available or on show, as it were. That seems to have kind of become more limited of late. And there was an important thing early on where I did a strip. Do you remember the SDP, Social Democratic?
Just about, yeah.
They split the Labour Party back in the days of Michael Foot. They were objecting to Michael Foot, who was too left-wing. So they set up this separate party. They split. But they weren't in government. They were out of government. Thatcher was getting going. She was quite unpopular at first, but the Falklands War came along to help her out and various other things. She sort of turned her position into from her early small majority into a massive majority of 140. But the reason she did that was because the SDP split the left vote. The SDP wanted to be moderate, wanted to be sensible, none of this lefty nonsense, and they ran their own candidates. Most of them spun off from the Labour Party. They had one or two. They had one Tory who became an SDP. Anyway, the SDP was a kind of I was always raving rabid against the SDP. And I did one strip which it was about Dr. David Owen, one of the leaders, the Gang of Three, the SDP, and I looked at it, the strip, as it came on, as it printed. That's not what I wrote. They changed the wording of the strip. This was very early on. This is about 1981 or something like that. 1982, maybe. No, it's probably about 1982. Might be 1983. But I think it was pretty early on because I read it. I looked at it and thought, what the fuck's that? they've changed the meaning of the strip. So I thought, I got really cross about this. I sent a very stiff letter saying, what's going on? You've changed, you've actually changed, you forged my handwriting. Because the critical thing about the difference between editing, sub-editing text and sub-editing cartoons is, in order to sub-edit a cartoon, somebody has to forge your handwriting because it's all hand letter. So I actually, had quite a stiff exchange of letters with him. In those days, it was letters, and no email. And eventually, to his credit, he said, "Oh, perhaps you've got a point." I was saying this, you've forged my handwriting. One of his arguments was, "Oh, well, you've traduced the views of Dr. David Owen, Dr. Death, as I used to call him." But I said, "You've traduced my cartoon. You upended what I was trying to say." This is kind of, look, and we came to a kind of negotiated agreement. He said, "Look," and he agreed. He said, in future, unless it's desperate emergency, if there's change to be made, please let's consult on it and we can work it out. And in those days, there was enough leeway because I was doing a weekly strip, and there was about a week before they had one, and they had like 5 or 6 days before the thing was next printed. So there was a little bit of leeway, not much. And that was an important breakthrough because it established the principle that they don't muck about the strip unless they ask me and we agree it. So that was an important break, and that meant that I could just carry on and push the boundaries as however became possible. And things changed. They wanted more and more stuff. They wanted daily big ones. They wanted it in colour. I was quite happy to do it because it was paid very well and all the rest of it. So I did lull myself into a false sense of security. I think I probably thought I was irreplaceable, and of course it doesn't apply anymore. They don't give a shit.
But that artistic freedom strikes me as being really important. Because...
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's commonplace. It is, but you have to sort of somehow carve it out, carve the space out in the context you're working. I think what came in at The Guardian was a desire to micromanage and vet every joke, and that's how it was getting when the end came last year. They'd had some crisis about certain subjects being, a source of disagreement, and vast piles of emails would come in and all the rest of it, and comments and social media bollocks and all the rest of it. And they're playing safe. They didn't want to invoke certain responses. So I think,
as I sort of think about what you're doing,
yeah,
you're not telling people what's happened in the news, right? Because the cartoons only make sense if you know what the news story is. So you're providing a form of commentary on stuff people will already know to some extent, right? You'll look at it and you'll know what it's about.
Yeah.
And therefore you are, by default, you're taking a position on that. You want to provoke people into thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so I wondered, do the topics that you cover, did they just come to you naturally? Are you encouraged by the paper to cover particularly? How does that work?
There's no, well, in subsequent years, the paper just let me get on with it. No, it was a great laissez-faire thing. They just let me do it, and I probably was lulled into a false sense of security, but it was great. I didn't have to, because the business about when I first started doing the big ones, I've been doing the strip for 9 years, and nobody sort of said do this, do that. It was a strip. I had to plan it out, and it had its own logic. And I suppose having a strip like that meant that I didn't have to consult anybody. I just got on with it.
Because they've got a rough idea where you're going to go with it, right? You can't go too far.
I didn't really tell them what I was doing that week with the strip. I just do it. I had a sort of cast of characters and things that I'd be, working on, and they wouldn't suggest things. I'd just send it in, and they add it in. Like, if there were problems, they would get. But there was never, suggesting. When I started doing the big ones, which are of course more prominent in the paper and further up near the middle, so I suppose with the strip that you're in the back end of the paper, so you can get away with, you can sneak things in that sense. So it's because it's a strip. It's a kind of lowly medium, which nobody. But they are that bothered. But you can sneak about. With the big ones, the editorial ones, then you have to that worked out slightly differently because they started asking me to do them in about 1990, 91. And the first couple I did were as a result. The first one was about the fall of Thatcher. That was the one. It was and Geoffrey Howe's speech that did for her. And that was so. I did this, but her being. She was swinging, Tarzan, of course, it was Tarzan Heseltine. It wasn't, I didn't invent Tarzan, that's just what people called him because he swung the mace around his head. So he was Tarzan, and he was swinging through on a creeper, and the creeper was, he was swimming, I think it was involved in the legs of Margaret Thatcher, and the creeper was around her neck, and she was sort of being, that was it. That was the demise. And they were clinging to his buttocks or coattails was the dead sheep of Geoffrey Howe, who was called it's like being savaged by a dead sheep. And that was Dennis Healy who described that. That was a gift, cartoon gift. So Tarzan, you're using this language, which are great for cartoons. And that was the first one I did. And the idea came very simply. I thought, oh, that's too simple. I'll spend the next 2 hours sweating trying to think of something, and then after 2 hours the deadline is now looming. Oh Christ, what's the matter with that? That was a good idea. Go with it. Fuck this. So that taught me something. That's how deadlines can be beneficial. They teach you this terrifying thing is coming towards you. It makes you make decisions to do this, don't do that, do this. That's how it works. By this time fax had come in, so I was able to fax it directly to the offices, and that was much more instantaneous in terms of transmission. There was some glitches at first, but it worked out quite well. And then using that new technology was also quite interesting because I wasn't there. I wasn't going to the morning meetings discussing. I did start out talking to like the chief sub-editor, chief sub-editor of the comment and analysis pages, as it was called then. A very nice man called John Cunningham, and we'd have quite a long discussion again, like I'd done with Duncan, about what was going on, what's like. That was fine, that worked fine. But the pressures of a daily paper are even greater than a weekly one, and soon this fell into abeyance because I've been doing this strip. Nobody worried about it. It was quite nice chatting to John, but he had other stuff to do. He was busy, and it fell into abeyance. Neither of us needed it. And in the end, I was so just trusted to get on with it. And if there's a problem, we'll worry about that when it happens. And that was quite good. It was good, but also quite wearing. Not wearing for me, but wearing probably for them. That's probably I think the trouble was they didn't trust me by the end. They thought I was a loose cannon, or I was not coming up with the right opinions that they liked. So that was another thing.
It's an interesting sort of random element, I guess, when you're doing big ones, because the journalist, you got a rough idea where you're going to cover. You could come up with anything, and that's where I think your point around trust is really important. Yeah. But you need to know that trust is there.
Yeah.
So that you can just get on with it and do your thing. Because I could imagine the equivalent of someone standing over your shoulder, either in person or feeling like that wouldn't allow you to be you, right? That sort of starts to become.
No, that's true. Yeah. It would be very difficult. And I think that it does show in the cartoons, because what they like now is for people to submit roughs, 3 roughs. When young cartoonists start out, they'll get this, but you've got to get beyond it, because if you're having to think up 3 ideas for every one you do, it takes long enough to think up one good idea. Especially when you're doing a political cartoon. When you're doing gag cartoons, you have to think up 9 or 10 gags. And I always deeply admire gag cartoons because they can do that, and they can come up with brilliant gags. And like David Austin, who was a great gag cartoonist who did pocket cartoons in The Guardian, which I'm sad they never replaced him because he was brilliant. And he came after Brian McAllister, who was also brilliant, but I don't know why they designed him out. But anyway, that's another. Pocket cartoons are a genius thing. Matt is the only real. Well, no, he's not. There are other pocket cartoonists, but Matt's the most successful one in the Telegraph, and they cherish him, they value him because he's so bloody good, and he's a credit to us all. I think it's Matt. He is quite brilliant. He always has been, And I always take my hat off. But all gag Kipper's a gag cartoonist. They produce masses of gags, and it's all good stuff. It's all it's all quality stuff. When you're producing a set piece, then you've got a lot of drawing work to do. When you're producing a pocket, it's it's much it takes a lot of thinking, but it's much less graft in the drawing.
One of the things I found fascinating is, and you've talked a lot about this, about the evolution of how particularly political characters that you draw them. And there's the wonderful story of, there's a little video which I put a link to where you talk about the evolution of David Cameron and how you draw him and you end up with him as a condom, which I think shows a really creative imagination. And so I guess with each one, you're trying to get closer to something that is, I guess, easy to draw and represent your perspective on them.
Well, you're trying to say something. You said something about, it's just comment. Well, it is, this is largely comment. But comment is also about observing. It's also about seeing what's going on. So I'm giving my version, as it were. So I'm following stuff closely as well. So I've always liked the idea of, cartoon reportage. It's very difficult to put into practice. But so the idea of going somewhere, seeing something and drawing it is quite important. I did that very early on for Time Out. I went to see Margaret Thatcher in action doing her "The Lady Is Not for Turning" speech, and I was there. I watched her say it. It was terrifying, and that was the first. And that in a sense, got me hooked on going to party conferences because I went to every one after, almost every one after that. But the good thing is you get the things you get from seeing things, the things you get from. I can do little drawings, little sketches, and it helps when you have got to do a lot of stuff. That kind of gives you a kind of background. So there is always an element of reporting what you're looking at. You're not just commenting; you're reporting it in your own way. So I'm saying things that perhaps other people can't say in a written context. So there's that too. You've got, and that's the bit that tends to get swept away, I think, and it's unfortunate because I've made a good. I built myself a nice little niche at The Guardian, and it's blown to fuck. Never mind. I mean, I'm sure people will continue to do great work in The Guardian and elsewhere, but it's just not in the area of political cartoons at the moment because they've got these guidelines in place which just restrict any possibility of doing anything interesting. They have to clear all difficult jokes by 10:30 in the morning. They have to, the editorial. I think there's a weird thing that's crept in since Viner took over is an editorial committee, and these are kind of faceless, nameless people who you deal with. You really don't know who you deal with. It's because Viner herself actually doesn't like editing. She likes to delegate it to other people to do. She's editor-in-chief, so it's a strange business.
And so I definitely want to come on and sort of explore how the relationship progressed. But in terms of what you're doing as you're drawing characters, that requires you obviously to get not close and personal with the wrong way to put it, but you really need to get to grips with them. So you talk about going to party conferences. I presume you're watching a lot of things online on television as well. You get a sense of who these people are.
Well, what do they look like? Yeah. It's exactly. So it helps if you start with drawing them from life. Obviously, you're drawing from photos most of the time. You don't get that close access. But with Cameron, there was a certain element of going to see him at a conference and realising, God, this guy is smooth, and literally physically smooth. He's pink, and he doesn't appear to have any hair follicles. So if you get, and I'm not much of a photographer, but I have got a nice big camera with a telephoto lens, and you can actually focus on their follicles. And I'm with the photographers pretending to be a photographer, but I'm actually preparing little sketches that I can then use. I take thousands of photos as well, which are quite handy, but they're not really for reproduction. I'm not competing with my photographer chums. I get out of their way if they're on they want to get their angle, they get their shot. That doesn't matter to me. I'm just there for the experience and finding odd bits and bobs that come up. So I love that process.
So you're really, I presume it's a combination of what's going to be easy to render, but also you're just trying to create. I guess it's the essence of who they are. There's some aspect of it that you want to pull out.
The thing about the condom, I'll tell you the thinking behind the condom was I was trying to do Cameron, and I've been trying to do him for a year or two or more. And eventually there was this notion, it was the time of the MP's expenses scandal.
Yes.
This is before he came to power, as it were, so it's in the late noughties. And there was all kinds of ructions about the terrible sort of corrupt things they were up to, buying duck houses and all kinds of things they shouldn't have gone up to. And then Cameron got up on his hind legs. Cameron, who also incidentally claimed for his wisteria in his Oxfordshire home. Yes, fine, that's all right. Claimed your wisteria, that's all right. But he said, we must be transparent. He called for transparency. He has this way of speaking, a bit like a softer Margaret Thatcher. Transparency. And so I tried to think about transparency, and I drew him as a jellyfish. And it sort of almost worked. But the idea of a jellyfish, I'm Dave the jellyfish. He said, he's very smooth and he drifts through the water. But it was a pain in the bum drawing a jellyfish every day because they have quite elaborate tentacles and I have to use blue ink, and that's too complicated. You need to, as you suggested, you need to break it. It needs to be repeatable. It needs to be, something you keep using and carry on with. And then, quite by chance, it was the run-up to the 2010 election. Then Tories had this campaign. I'd been to his first conference. I mean, every conference he'd been to, except I think 2005 when I couldn't go that year. But he was quite very distinctive to look at, and I sort of had this sort of soapy pink bloke. But it wasn't until I saw these posters come up all over the country with this head on one side, which is his head, saying, "Oh, cut the deficit, not the NHS." So this is about cutting the deficit, right. The NHS, which it's a complete lie. I knew it was a complete lie, but that's what he was saying. Terribly responsible. I care about the NHS. And I thought, God, fucker. And what I did was, there's this photo of him, and I sort of unrolled a condom over the thing, because it's just this impudent penis of a talking this shit, talking these shitting lies about how he's going to cut the deficit, not the NHS. It's just bollocks. And in light of what's happened subsequently, it's not bollocks at all. That's exactly what they did. So the condom came out of that. It was him. I unrolled a condom, a giant condom on this figure in the poster. And for me, that worked a treat. And it was published. But then I had a memo next day from the editor who didn't like the idea of the condom. He thought it was rude. He thought, bits of rubber. It was a kind of sniffiness. And this is Alan Rusbridger, who's a different kettle of fish to Peter Preston in many ways, though they share a lot of qualities too. But he didn't like it at all, and he sort of made it be known through third parties, actually, through the chief subs on the page, passed on the message that the editor didn't want to see any more condoms. I said, what's he talking to me about? Anyway, we had a kind of a standoff and a showdown, which lasted months. It went on for a couple of months. As in January, I did the cartoon, which worked. Then he didn't want to see any condoms. I did him as a kind of balloon. It doesn't work. A balloon, condom, it's not the same. Condom has a kind of air of pink rudeness about it, which is funny. Nothing else. It's just so. Anyway, by some weird process unknown to me, I went into the paper at one time and we had at least one stand-up row about it. I said, look, this is nonsense. All school kids know what a condom is. This post-age condom. In the strip back in the 80s, I was drawing Captain Condom. That was William Whitelaw as Captain Condom. It was just a man, a great big condom man, a rubbery man. And for some reason, Whitelaw was given the responsibility of spreading the word about the need to use condoms. Don't ask me why, I cannot remember. But anyway, so Captain Condom, it's something I'd done in the paper already. So condoms were perfectly doable, but Rusbridger had a moment of prudery. Anyway, I tried and the balloons weren't working. Anyway, late one evening, I had an odd email stroke text message. I think it was coming from, in those days, it was Blackberries. Everybody had Blackberries. It must have come from the editor, so it must have been an email, an editor's Blackberry. And it said, I'm at a dinner. This is from Raspberry. I'm at a dinner. I'm being trashed for the condom ban. The condom ban is hereby revoked. It was at a fucking dinner. Apparently, it was with a dinner with people from the advertising, people who handle the Guardian's advertising account. And so, why he succumbed to them and didn't listen to my entreaties, I don't know. But anyway, he lifted the ban, so it was all right to do condoms after. So of course, I went.
Go to town then, right?
I went to town on condoms. I just did condom. Then I actually had a run-in with Condom Man himself in the 2010 election, when he actually came up to me and said, "What's this condom thing all about?" He literally said that to me. I've never had a character say that to me before. So I had to think on my feet. So I said, well, it's to do with your extreme youth, because much younger than I am, and the smoothness of your complexion, which is partly true. I couldn't go outright and say, because you're a prick. Politeness prevailed. And he said, he subsequently said, it happened again. There's some other dude. He came sweeping past. Oh, it's still doing the old condom thing. I said, yeah, this was by this time he was in government. He'd won the election, or sort of semi-won the election of 2010. Go to government with coalition with the Liberals, and he said, "You're still doing that old condom thing." So I said, "Yeah." And I said, mentally registered. He doesn't like it, because before I didn't know what do you mean he doesn't. He clearly doesn't like it, and his parting shot as he drifted off with his entourage was, "You can only push a condom so far." And maybe a lot of people agree with him. I don't know. I couldn't stop doing it.
But it's interesting because it strikes me that sort of red rag to bull territory, in the sense that, like, if someone tells you that, in fact, we kind of know where he's going with that, which is sort of like, stop doing this, right? I can't tell you to stop doing it, because I'm going to send you, which of course you're only going to take one way. Yeah. Which is like, I've got through at some level. And so I guess the political activist in you likes that, but also the cartoonist must be going, right, this is resonated, game on here.
Yeah, I mean, I did him for years, and then he evaporated, he shot out of the window, a flash of rough twang, and he was gone. I did a nice fight. I think my parting thing was him stretched over the kitten heel leopard skin shoe of May, of course, who took over, and that was quite nice, because it's a drawing that drew itself. But then that was it. He was gone. He shot his bolt, and he didn't come back actually until after I was gone. So.
And where you've got these characters that, I'll be polite here, your politics isn't aligned with.
Yeah.
Is it like really annoying to have to spend time studying them, or is there a gleeful joy because you're looking for something that you can, I guess, make fun of?
Yeah, a bit of both. It's painful in some ways because you have to sit through god awful speeches, but then there's also a gleeful joy and interest in the things you see and the mad stuff that happens. And the odd characters you meet. I mean, like Grayling was another one. I bumped into Grayling at the back of it was a party conference, I think it was in the days of William Hague. And the Tories were, in deep shit. They were way out. Blair was riding high. And I think it was obviously before Hague lost the 2001 election. So we didn't know he was going to lose it as badly as he did. But, the Tories made a net gain of 1 seat, I think. So that was the end of Hague. So the Tories, then they had IDS, and that was deeply fascinating as well, watching that and seeing God.
With the exception of the US, where we seem to have resurrections, we've heard a turnover of characters. One of the things that strikes me that if you sort of looked at the recent prime ministers would be a good example of. I mean, that must be quite frustrating in a way, because you're starting to get to grips with it and then you've moved on to the next one.
Well, that's right, yeah, because I remember that spell of when you had May, quickly followed by Bozza. Bozza didn't last long, but he won an election. And then the Bozza Truss, Rishi, yes, in quick succession. That was insane. It was just ridiculous.
So one of the things I think is interesting, people sort of say it's the satirists I feel sorry for. I'm guessing from a cartoonist perspective, aside from the having to learn your characters and find those attributes, I presume this is gold dust, all the crap that's going on.
I suppose it is, but it's I think there is a point you think, oh God, how much of this do I need? It's like, there's a real problem with someone like Trump, who is self-satirizing and self-parodying. He consciously parodies himself, and it's almost like a golden, cast iron rule of satire. You cannot parody a parody. You can try, you can do your best, but because he's taking the piss out of himself, he's very difficult to deal with. So my sort of method was a kind of outright rejection method. Just doing it was a huge bog, toilet with a golden lid for his hairdo. And that was, it worked. It's full of shit and all that stuff, but it's not very gratifying as always. Whether he liked it or not, I don't really. The Americans, I think American cartoons are great in many ways, and it's a very vital cartoon culture. But it is also very constrained in terms with there's a lot of stuff I can get away with that Americans, cartoons would not even attempt or dream of, because it's kind of a commercial censorship, if you like, because American cartoons depend on syndicating stuff around loads of papers. Now that's reducing because the number of papers is reducing like crazy in the States. The number of cartoonists is also getting hammered. They're getting screwed across the board. There's still lots of great cartoonists in the States. There's lots of cartoonists who've been sacked for doing anti-Trump cartoons. Can you believe, being sacked for doing an anti-Trump? That happened to Rob Rogers in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. It happened to others in other places. It's just, the proprietors stepped in. No, there are too many anti-Trump cartoons here. And it's just a simple act of censorship because they disagree with what you're saying. In some extent, that's what happened to me at The Guardian. They disagree with what I was saying, certainly on Gaza, possibly also on Ukraine and various other stories. Certainly the Labour Party, they didn't see eye to eye with me. So there's probably too many areas where we not just drifted, but diverged quite. But the sad thing is that they didn't consider the paper could stand it. I mean, it makes a blander paper, if you like. It doesn't have contrary opinions in it. But I don't know. So what you do in that context with Trump, I don't know. I mean, I don't envy people, having to wrestle with Trump every day. Well, that's one thing you have to keep. We all have to live under the fucker, whether we're doing cartoons or not. Sometimes doing a cartoon can be a blessed release. It gets it out of your system. And I do miss that. I do miss that catharsis of hitting the spot and getting, making a point about something. And it's very gratifying. Being published is very gratifying too. The only things I'm publishing at the moment is The Journalist, which is the trade paper of the National Union of Journalists. So I've got a regular slot there. And I'm doing mugs. I've got a very nice bunch called Philosophy Football who produce mugs. So I just done a Trump mug for his second inauguration. That'll be quite nice.
You're very passionate about your beliefs, and that comes through what you do. Do you see your cartoons as a form of activism? Because one of the things that's frustrating, when you are being published, but even not, given your profile, your output will be seen by people. And so, yes, there's a protest and making a point element to it, but you are actually potentially visible to people who could affect change, who are in political positions. And so, strikes me as being potentially quite a powerful outlet for political activism.
Well, I suppose so. I always saw myself as having a political element to what I was doing, so I'm very conscious of that. I mean, it doesn't really matter anymore because I haven't got the outlet. But I mean, it is something you cannot deny. You've got you're being read by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and being seen by more. And these things get about, and you get people commenting from all over the place. And yes, of course, you have an influence. It might not be much of an influence. It might not make a blind bit of difference in many ways, but it does. It's foolish to pretend you don't have an influence. So yeah, I've seen it in that light. So yeah, there is an element of political activism. I will confess. I wanted to peddle my views, foist off my views on the public at large, as far as I can. But whether the public wants it or not, well, that's a different question.
Stephen, as I knew with the time has absolutely flown. So firstly, thank you for just being an amazing guest on the show. Just like the incredible story, fascinating insight, so many things that I've learned and you've made me laugh and learn at the same time, which is the biggest compliment. So I don't know what you're talking about with this. I'm not cut out for teaching. I think you absolutely are, but I'm glad the teaching career didn't work out because I think you've added
teaching a group of 30 kids in a school is different. I do admire. I mean, I do admire teachers, and all my kids had very good teachers, but not like me. I was not a good teacher.
I will put a link in the show notes to the blog where you talk about your teaching career in very colourful language. And in fact, your entire website is a joy to read. Right? It's written with as people have detected, right? You're very engaging. The way you've written, that's fabulous. So I'm going to put a link to that and obviously your cartoons in the show notes. But thank you so much for everything that you do, because I think you just add insight. You've made me smile and you've made me think, both on the show, but also in the work that you put out there. So thank you so much. But above all, thank you for a brilliant episode.
All right, cheers.
So that's it for another episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Steve, not just for appearing, but also for approaching the show in the spirit that he did. It's wonderful when guests just freely share their insights, experience, and perspectives, and he definitely did that. Also, my thanks to his son, Will, for helping to set this episode up, and for his support for human risk in general. My thanks also, of course, to you for listening. To find out more about Steve, his work, to see some of the political references that we talked about, have a look in the show notes. You'll find links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. With over 300 episodes, there's a strong chance you'll find something there of interest. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember to channel your inner cartoonist. And thank you so much for listening.